Good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Eigenraam. I'm from the Institute for the Development of Environmental Economic Accounting. The short version is we call ourselves the IDEEA group. A little bit about myself. I come from a farm. I did agricultural and resource economics as an undergraduate, worked in agriculture for a long time, and then I moved to what was considered the dark side and did environmental economics. Specialised in the development of payments for ecosystem services for a long time. And then the United Nations were running a process to write a new standard for national accounting that would recognise the environment, and it's called the System of Environmental Economic Accounts. In the lead up to 2012, I was a part of those working groups, which was a part of the writing groups. And in 2012, it was formally released by the United Nations. And there was two parts to it. There's the central framework and there's ecosystem accounting. The first part was formally signed off as a statistical standard by the United Nations, recognising a whole lot of environmental assets, and that's quite a big step forward from a national statistics accounting point of view. The second part proved to be a little bit tricky and couldn't get through the system at the time, and that was focusing on ecosystem accounting. So it was published and titled Experimental Ecosystem Accounting. About a year ago, though, there was a decision made by the UN and all the partner agencies to review that, and it will become a formal standard in 2020. So it's going through a review process at the moment. And if you contact your National Statistics Office, you'd actually find there is a process where you could contribute to reviewing elements of that as it's distributed and reviewed. Today, though, we're talking about ecosystem accounting, so we're focusing on the second publication. I think one of the things that became apparent almost immediately was that the ecosystem accounting is probably more relevant at the farm and local level than it is at the national level. It's important at the national level to understand the relationship between ecosystems and economic and social well-being, but where the rubber hits the road or where the real activity is at the farm level or landscape level management. And one of the other key messages that's coming through is that it's more than just accounting in the traditional sense of looking at tables of opening stocks, closing stocks and what has changed. This is actually spatial accounting. So first of all, you start in space with location and then you might produce tables. So that spatial context is particularly important because it's a recognition of the relationship between people, economies, urban centres and the environment. And that's very specific and location specific, so that's quite important. So my presentation is broken up into three parts. The first part is I'm going to give you the whirlwind tour of the SEEA, and I don't expect that when you get to the end of that anybody's going to be an expert. It takes quite a lot. There are 400 or 500 pages you can go and read if you wish to. It's quite interesting actually, particularly the introduction. It's really quite inspiring. And then the last part I'll give you two examples. One will be focused at the firm level on a forestry firm and how they've applied it, and the other one will be talking about the peri-urban relationship between open space and using ecosystem accounting to describe that. So the latter part is sort of to get into the nitty-gritty, does this actually work, and the first part is just to give you the overview. I also encourage you to ask questions, because otherwise I'm going to stand here talking and talking and talking, and it's great if you ask a question so I can have a bit of a break. So, first part, there are four key elements to the SEEA framework. There's environmental flows, which include traditional things like water, energy, emissions and things like that. There are natural resource stocks, timber, fish, minerals. Many of those things are already included in the system of national accounts, but now there's a more formal recognition of those stocks as having an asset value. So previously that wasn't accounted for as much. Environmental transactions. This doesn't appear to be that important, but there are a lot of transactions that are associated with the environment. So the example in the context when we were running environmental markets was we were paying farmers to manage their land in a different way to provide ecosystem services over and above the provisioning services of, say, wheat, meat and wool. But when that payment was recognised in the system of national accounts and in government ledgers, it came under agriculture, so it wasn't a part of the environmental sector. Now, if you imagine if you're spending millions of dollars on those environmental outcomes, there's tractors, fencing, there's labour, there's a whole lot of things that are associated with that expenditure, but it's not seen as a part of the economy. And I think that's a real lacking, because the environmental sector itself is a valuable part of the economy. So those environmental transactions are an important thing to be considering going into the future. The last box then is ecosystem assets and services. And I think that's where, you know, that's the fundamental. It's thinking now of an ecosystem as an asset. It's recognising that it could be depreciated, it could be degraded as condition changes, and the suite of services it provides are both monetary and non-monetary. And that's what I'll step through now. Taking a little bit of a deeper dive into those 4 boxes then, you can see here there are many elements. So in the environmental flows, water, energy, greenhouse gases, the natural resources, including minerals, soil resources. So soil is also included more formally now as a part of the accounting process where it's never been before. The environmental transactions, and then the ecosystems themselves, where within the ecosystems you're really taking a deep dive into things like a wetland, a river reach, a particular vegetation type within the landscape. One thing to note is that we don't make a differentiation between an agricultural system and a natural system. So if you're producing pasture, it is an ecosystem. Okay, so it is operating, it's accumulating biomass, we harvest that biomass and we convert it either into meat or other products, but it is an ecosystem, and society has made a choice to change that ecosystem for different purposes. But we need to now more formally recognise what do those choices mean, because we're having an impact on a suite of services rather than just producing food. So I think bringing those two together rather than having the divide between the two of them. The key though then is, if you think about those 4 boxes, there's a lot of relationships, and this is just a very brief example of the potential relationships. In the past, what you'd see is that if there's measurement and accounting or reporting in any one of those boxes or any element of one of those boxes, it's done independent of the other boxes, and it's very hard to join that information up in a coherent way. The accounting process brings with it principles and guidelines that say if you're collecting this information, this is the way you need to collect it, so you can join those boxes together and you can start to explore cause and effect across the different areas. Let's then assume for the moment we have a set of ecosystems. They're well defined, well delineated, well understood on the left hand side. Put it through the SEEA framework, and then many decision makers can use that set of information. So the key message from this slide and this next slide is, if you have a coherent set of environmental information on the left hand side, and I'm emphasising coherent, that all decision makers are drawing on the same set of information. Now what we find at the moment is most of those decision makers, and particularly in government and across government agencies, is that they're using a different set of information. So when they come together to try and have a discussion, a lot of the time the discussion is blocked because they don't actually agree on what they're talking about. But if you have a coherent set of information, then we can get on with the conversation about what we're doing. Now, if you think about traditional economic accounting, when you turn up and you've got a set of economic data, traditional economic data, when everybody enters the room, they already know what that economic data is, how it was designed, how it was collected, and then the conversation is about making decisions on how you use that data. The other thing I take away from this is the SEEA accounting does not define a set of indicators. Okay? What it's saying is that we will collect information in a coherent, consistent way, and then you as an agency or a decision maker can design your own indicators from that set of information. Now, I think the benefit of that is that if I have an indicator or you have an indicator, and then we come together and we find that our indicator is either moving in different directions or doing different things, we can go back to the same set of information and understand where those differences come from. Whereas traditionally, if we met, we'd say, well, our indicator's going in a different direction, what's going on? Well, this is going to be really hard because I use totally different approaches when I was collecting my data, so it makes that conversation very tricky. So this is the core element. Reducing all of that complexity down, fundamentally most of our work we start here. It's our 4-box core accounting model. On the left-hand side we have assets, so we understand the extent of asset. So that's a spatial question. Where is the asset? How big is the asset? A lot of the time the guidelines suggest you homogenise the landscape into discrete ecosystem elements. You then explore the condition of that asset, and that's where a lot of the ecology comes in. What sort of measures do you use to describe the condition of that asset? And then fundamentally, the relationship between how big your asset is and then its condition. The better the condition, the more services it can potentially provide. The worse the condition is, the less services you get. Those services then provide us with benefits. And generally, this is a view through humanity's eyes of what those benefits are. And those benefits are both monetary and non-monetary. The accounting does not require at all or in any way that you move to monetary values. And actually, a lot of the time, most of our work is in what we're describing as physical accounting. So if you actually go to the SEEA and look and search through it on physical accounting, you'll find most of it is about physical accounting, and then there's a question about how do we convert those physical measures into monetary measures. And sometimes that's appropriate and sometimes that's not. I suppose then if you look at those boxes, from a management or decision-making point of view, starting from the left, you can change the extent, so you can change the area of an ecosystem. You can intervene to improve the condition of an ecosystem. So you might have a piece of native bush that's infested by invasive species. You go in there, remove this invasive species, and that piece of bush then, as an ecosystem, operates better. And then you have a suite of ecosystem services. And I think it's important there to emphasise a suite. So it's no longer saying that an ecosystem is just producing one thing, it is producing a suite of services. And depending on how you intervene or manipulate the condition of that ecosystem, you can change the portfolio of those services that you're receiving. Okay? This is just a sort of the fundamental idea. We currently have a condition. You undertake economic activity or investments that may result in a decline in the condition of that ecosystem. You may be maintaining that condition or you may be improving it. The accounting is not arguing for any one of those, but it's saying that's what we need to measure and we need to recognise. So it may be possible to use an ecosystem, allow its condition to decline through time, but then make an investment in the future which brings its condition back up. So it's not necessarily saying we must improve everything must be maintained. We recognise that sometimes there isn't enough budget to go around, so you allow something to decline a little bit further, but we're making a trade-off saying, well, in the future we'll invest in that to ensure that that condition comes back up. We also link that then to the suite of services that you're actually looking at. What is it that you're investing for? What service are you looking for to be coming from that? This is just to reinforce the idea again that really it is about spatial accounting. So where you are in the landscape is fundamentally important with respect to the ecosystems. And from an accounting point of view, there's this question about boundary conditions, and what it's really saying is that can we define a boundary between the ecosystem and an economic actor to understand the transactions between an economic actor and an ecosystem, okay? So when an ecosystem is operating within that, there might be biomass accumulation going on within a pasture. But if you think of it as a construct in your mind, when the farmer enters that ecosystem, then they're bringing capital and labour to that ecosystem. They're combining it with the services that that ecosystem has provided, which was biomass accumulation. That then results in maybe the harvest of hay, which then leaves that ecosystem. So there's been a transaction between that farmer and that ecosystem. And what this is about is thinking about how do we fundamentally recognise that transaction in physical terms, so the removal of that biomass, and then once that biomass is removed, it's entering the economy so it has a monetary value. Now, and we do that fundamentally across any other ecosystem, so thinking about that transaction with the ecosystems. This then is a stylised version of that, recognising that there are many different services all over the landscape. One of the things that this diagram doesn't actually represent too well is that you have many of those services stacked upon one another within the landscape. So there's not just one service in one cell, there is many services in one cell, and that configuration is important. And each time you do something within one of those cells, you're impacting on the suite of those services. I think the other thing that comes through, or should come through within this picture, is that there's a relationship between each one of those cells. So they're not independent. You're not managing these cells independently. There is also ecosystem services going from an ecosystem to another ecosystem. They're not entering the economy at all, but we need to ensure that we are measuring those because there is dependence between those. And there's certainly path dependence between humanity and those ecosystems of those services passing from one to the other. So in short, some of the key issues associated with ecosystem services, we're seeing those services as a part of the production. So it's a part of standard production that an ecosystem is undertaking. The ecosystem is a producing unit. It's not just something that we care about, it's actually doing something for us. It is producing something in some sort of way. The definition and classification is very important because the fundamental measurement then of those ecosystems is important. Linking the economic and human activity within the landscape to the configuration of those ecosystems, the condition of them, and also ensuring that the connection between the measurement and the asset extent is well understood. So if we are making investments within an ecosystem or within the landscape, we understand that. And ensuring that the measurement of the different services for the same ecosystem asset are based on common and shared set of information, so that depending on who's entering and using this shared set of information, you can use it for different purposes. Any questions? You're all very quiet. Very good class. Key points. Establish your environmental unit. So fundamentally, if we are talking about natural capital accounting, we're fundamentally talking about let's establish what this natural capital unit is. And we would use the language in environmental economic accounting, well, that is an ecosystem with a spatial context and a place and a boundary. Valuation emerges once you have an understanding of that, and it is something that comes further down the track, and it's not the primary purpose of the accounting in any way. The spatial location and configuration is essential, and particularly for formulating policy responses. And whether that's decision making within the firm, as I'll show you in the forestry example, or whether it's decision making if you're thinking about a peri-urban or an urban context, it is definitely spatial. So the policy making and decision making, it's linking this spatial configuration to decision making, where I think a lot of the time in the past there's blanket policies which you say, well, this is a policy, we need more of something, and then program managers or project managers go out there and they look for more of something, and there's no real sort of strategy or tactical response in what about the configuration of the landscape, what is that relationship, can we do that better and understand that better. So that's the end of part one, the introduction to ecosystem accounting. I think Hannah now will be handing out some tests, and it's multiple choice, so it's okay. No? Okay. Any questions before I go into the next part? There is no largest or smallest. Generally, we divide the landscape into grids. A lot of the time we use a 100 metre by 100 metre grid, because just from a computational point of view we can do that, and we can generally do that at country level. But if you wanted to go lower than that because it was relevant from a scientific point of view, then you'd go lower. The area of the ecosystem then is an aggregate of those units. So it might be 25 hectares of contiguous type 1 vegetation. So it's an aggregate of all of those elements. Because recognising that the ecosystem on top is sitting on a different soil profile, so the soil profile will vary underneath, so the behaviour from a water point of view changes across that. So you need to recognise that relationship. I beg your pardon? Yep. Yep. Generally, the question on resolution is one really associated with your level of risk. The finer and finer and finer you go, you're probably getting closer to a more accurate answer sometimes. But it's whether that extra 2, 3, 4, 5% accuracy is really going to fundamentally change your decision in relative terms across the landscape. And that's a trade-off that we need to make. But I think at least asking that question and making that question explicit is an important part of the measurement process. Rather than generally more information is better. Because information costs money. It costs money to do that.
Just in terms of, you said for your spatial resolution, what kind of thematic resolution? In an ideal scenario, Ireland's not a massive country, but what kind of classification would you be using? Like would we cover?
Ah, right. That's always the big question. There is no fixed classification of what you should be using. There are, I think, 16 or 17 classifications of land cover within the SEEA central framework, but from a decision-making point of view, they're not very useful. Okay, so when you get to the local level, they're not very useful. In the context within Victoria, we have something like 120 land use classifications. But then when you look in the natural classification and we look at ecological vegetation classes, the ecological vegetation classes then go down to about 500. Okay? So it's up to you. It depends on what you want to do. But the point is they are nested. They are definitely nested. So if I look at any one of those cells and I apply a classification system, it needs to be nested. So eventually it will come to the 16 classes at the national level. But for ecological integrity and a whole lot of other decision making, you must be able to drill down, or otherwise the accounting system is failing us. Any other examples before I move on? Yes, sir.
Presentation you mentioned about like it's great looking at physical landscape and later on and monetary and economic further decision making is made after the work that you initially do. Do you know how? Have you seen examples of it being used to look at non-monetary values and non-tangible ecosystem services and cultural services?
Yep.
Does it work very well for that as well?
Yes. There are a lot of examples of that being undertaken. We're now initiating a project in southern Australia with the First Nations people, and it relates back to the question we had here about classification of the landscape. If we have a conversation with First Nations about a Western classification of land use and ecological vegetation classes, it doesn't mean anything to them. They have a completely different way of classifying that landscape. So what we're doing is trying to join up their classification, their knowledge and their way of actually measuring what a representation of condition is. So when we're standing out in the field, there's classic examples. They say, when that tree flowers, we know that this fish is going to spawn in this area. And we've seen this and we know this occurs all the time. And the scientists now have come along and gone, oh my goodness, it's actually true. You know, whereas normally what it would be is a completely independent piece of science looking at the fish and looking at the plant and going, well, there's absolutely no connection here. But the First Nations are saying, if you don't have that, this doesn't occur. So you can apply that. It's important, I think, because it allows for the crosswalk between the different knowledges and the different classifications. It's not saying that this cell or this area in the landscape has to be one thing. It just means that we're allowing for the crosswalk so we can have that conversation. Okay. Diving into the forestry example, unless there are any other questions. No? So I spoke to you a lot about the units. This is a forestry firm. We started work with them, I think it's around about 2 years ago now. And the CEO was quite interested in understanding more about the ecosystem services that his firm was providing within the landscape. They have a portfolio of 180,000 hectares. 80,000 of those hectares are native forests within Tasmania, and they can't harvest them in any way. Okay? But they have an obligation to manage them in order to maintain their condition. Okay? When we had these first conversations, they had this conversation with us saying, well, there's this non-productive part of our estate, and here's the productive part of the estate. Now, what are we going to do with ecosystem accounting? Because this non-productive stuff, you know, it's just no good and we can't do anything with it. 2 years later, now we have the productive estate. Okay? There is no non-productive or productive. It's a recognition that the whole estate is actually providing a suite of ecosystem services. Now, a big part of that was actually then going through the delineation of the spatial units within that landscape. So in the left-hand column here, we now have a classification system that works for them. Now, this classification system is specific for them because their business is already working around that, okay? But if we look at the nature one, nature formal reserves and other natural ecosystems, formal reserves is a recognition of some of the laws around the use of that land. So there's a formal overlay which says you must do this. And the other ones is just native land without any legal titles sitting over the top of it. But if you dive into those, you'll end up in ecological vegetation classes starting at the grouping level of around about 90 classes, and then you can go within those 90 classes right down to the ecological detail, and it's nested down and it goes to around about 300 or 400 classes. So it allows them now to have those conversations with the ecologists from a business point of view, because their classification system, this whole table, we can disaggregate it right down to every single ecological vegetation class. And then they have their plantation classes, built assets and other things. And then basically, you know, it's telling you then the area. And the study that we went into detail was the Greater Surrey Hills, and that made up around about 80,000 sort of hectares out of the overall area. This is just an overview of the management zones, and it's aggregated even further into natural, plantation, non-forest use and infrastructure. And noting that this map then represents 100 metre by 100 metre grid cells right across the whole landscape. So every single point within that landscape is attributed with a classification and some ecosystem services. I can't see on the screen here, so it's a little bit difficult. It's very small here. Here are the high-level Tasmanian vegetation groups. What we're finding is that the government's classification of the landscape, you can see here in the top, agricultural, urban and exotic vegetation. It's almost like that's the two hard box. So we've got the stuff that we think we know about from a natural point of view, and then there's this other stuff. And it's quite interesting that their native overlay for the state includes that classification. Whereas, you know, would you contrast that with a dry eucalypt forest woodland? It doesn't sort of quite make sense. But what this allows us to do now, and particularly from the forestry firm's point of view, is have a discussion with the government, because the forestry firm actually knows a lot more about the ecological classes that they have within their 180,000 hectares than the government actually knows what's going on out there. And there are conversations now right across the Tasmanian government and the forestry sector to say, can we now harmonise all of our work within the classification, so when we're having those conversations and thinking about species, restoration, maintenance, investment in the landscape, we're actually talking about the same thing, and we don't have outliers of agricultural, urban and exotic vegetation any longer, so harmonising that. What's interesting is a part of the communication that Foreco undertakes is about special management zones. So they recognise that the community see the landscape as having particular values within the landscape. And it might be catchment protection, coming to the question of cultural aboriginal. There are particular areas that have got scar trees or middens within the landscape. And so what they do is they overlay then also spatial areas of special interest. So then they can stack those spatial areas on top of one another and start to understand, are there areas within the landscape that have a whole lot more interest than other areas? And this then is the conversation that they're having with many of the NGOs and the local stakeholders, because they can say to the First Nations people, tell me the areas that are important to you. We'll overlay that. That information might be either private or public. And then when we're managing the landscape, we can co-manage the landscape. So when we're entering this landscape, we know what's going on within the landscape. What is also beneficial then is that those stakeholders that are having this conversation with Foreco, they can actually join together, because it turns out there's a lot of places in the landscape where they have commonality. So rather than Foreco then having bilateral discussions with each one of the stakeholders, they can have a discussion with all of the stakeholders and say, look, we've found this places in the landscape where all of you have an interest. Let's jointly manage this place in the landscape. Now, that makes the conversation a lot easier, but it also reduces the cost significantly for all parties, because you're not having these one-off conversations and you're co-investing in the landscape. These are vegetation assessment scores by vegetation type in 2017. So Foreco themselves, they invest in weeding, fire management, pest control, removement of wildlings, a whole lot of other things. This previously, from an accounting point of view, was just coming straight in as a cost item, okay? And every time it came as a cost item, the board look at it and the CFO look at it and go, you know, this is a real problem. But now we're linking that change in condition and change in the provision of services to say, well, this is no longer a cost item. This is an investment in the maintenance of an asset that's providing more services. So the conversation's turning around. Also, when they're making that investment, now they can partner with government. If the government is saying, we've got this real problem with this pest or we're missing this particular species, they can say, well, now we can co-invest, because what we are as a forestry firm is professional land managers, okay? We're already in the landscape, we're already doing this. This is our daily bread and butter. We can actually do this with you to provide more services. Well, 0 to 100, 100 is perfect. 0 is a very poor condition, and so basically that's it. And the VCA is an ecologically based vegetation condition assessment that includes, you know, canopy, trees, shrubs, grasses, mosses, underground cover, hollow logs, age of trees, density, and that type of thing. And it's a standardised process so that you have a benchmark for each one of the vegetation classes. There's a paper by Parks et al. Called Habitat Hectares. A lot of the scoring that we've done in Australia has actually worked from that foundation. Good question. Yes, I'd say so. Yeah, total area, and then the breakdown of the area by condition. I'll remember to label that, sorry. This is where we've gone across the ecosystem assets and overlaid some of the services to say, well, actually, you know, is it 1 service, 2 services, 3 services, or 4? And it's very clear that, you know, they're providing more than 1, and this is just the first cut assessment, so there's a lot more than just 4 services. We can then also represent this spatially, and so what we've done is we've normalised the data to between 0 and 1, and then just present that as a heat map. So if you look at the carbon sequestration, red areas have the potential for more carbon, and the yellow areas have potential for less carbon. The same with the water provisioning, habitat provisioning. The habitat provisioning is a bit patchy because we haven't undertaken the analysis and the sampling right across the landscape. But from a data point of view, it doesn't make a lot of difference. What it does from the accounting point of view, we would just say, well, those cells are empty, okay? If it's important to you, then go and sample, but it's not a necessary condition that you have sampled the entire landscape, okay? And I think that's an important thing, because we can't invest in data, you know, continuously. We have to make it a trade-off. Where do we actually go to invest in that data? The other one then is timber provisioning, and then the final ones we overlay all of the services normalised, so you can start to see a heat map emerge. Some of the other things then from an investment point of view is we're linking that then to soil, so soil type, slope, wood provisioning services, surface water runoff, and that type of thing. So what they're thinking now is, well, we've got areas of land which are steep, they're not very good at water holding capacity, the trees grow a lot slower. Can we trade off those parts of the landscape, convert them back to native, and then take another area which might be a stranded area of 4 or 5 hectares of native that's declining anyway because it's completely stranded, use it for productive forestry and make that trade-off and make it explicit within the landscape. Yep. Yes. Yes. Yep. So it's a piece of software that I've jointly developed over the last 15, 20 years. And it's basically a grid-based piece of software to analyse the data and produce the accounts. It does biophysical modelling, a whole lot of other. I beg your pardon? NSIM, yep. The Environmental Systems Modelling Platform. If you Google it, you'll find a link to it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In my mind, it doesn't. In my mind, it just puts a set of information in front of us and now we can have a conversation. I think previously we've entered the room without this information and we're in conflict because it's either habitat or forestry. But now we're saying, well, okay, look, you want more habitat. We've got 180,000 hectares here. Do you want it everywhere? Well, of course we want it everywhere. It has to be everywhere. Well, that's not going to happen. So let's think about where you actually want it. Is there a species, in here in the Surrey Hills, butterfly, there's a particular butterfly that's very important. Okay, let's target that first. Or it might be the freshwater crayfish. Let's look at the riparian zones associated with that. Let's work on that strategically rather than decide black and white on or off. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, it is extremely difficult as well, but I think that's I believe in the environment, but I think that's a problem for us in the environment. Drawing a hard line and saying yes or no is not necessarily solving the landscape solution. We can pick a place within the landscape and stick to our guns and tie ourselves to the tree, but still the landscape is changing. How do we optimise that and have that conversation? Because one of the interesting things is that Forico is FSC compliant. That's the Forest Stewardship Council compliant, and they have a classification of HCVs, high conservation value. Once it's defined as high conservation value, that's it. It's a black and white. You just can't go near it. Right? It just seems really odd from a standards point of view that you would do that. Because there's no trade-off, because Forico clearly can find high conservation value classes defined by the standard, but you wouldn't invest anything in them and look after them because they're isolated, they're in the wrong place, it's just not working for them. You're better off going somewhere else and going, well, actually, we're going to change the landscape, we're going to bring it over here, and our objectives from an environmental point of view are going to be met much better than drawing that line. But I hope, though, that with this type of information, we can have a more informed discussion. We then modelled those ecosystem services from a physical point of view. So we ran hydrological models. We did some habitat modelling. We ran a carbon sequestration model. So there is a carbon sequestration model that's used at the national level for international reporting obligations. And then looked at the quantity of those services across the landscape. We have also converted this table to monetary values, but that information is retained internally for their internal decision making. It's not really numbers you'd put out there because it's model numbers and they don't really exist until you have a transaction. But from the first point of view, their point to us is that we couldn't have this conversation before, because when we were talking to people, we didn't know what we were talking about. We didn't know what we had. Now we do know what we have. Now we can start to have that conversation. The final element now is we're in our final phase of work, or near final phase of work with them, is that the CFO was on board right from the get-go. So this wasn't entering through the sustainability reporting doorway. This was entering through the CEO and the CFO. The CFO said from the get-go is, if you don't make it relevant to me from accounting, this is a communication exercise, okay? And it's like, well, okay, that's perfectly fine. So the final phase now is we're working directly with the CFO, his team, chart of accounts, ledgers, the whole box and dice, so that when they're collecting information, when the field staff are out there and they're about to do a weeding thing, they enter it into their iPad. It's connected to the chart of accounts and the ledger system, and it's already coded automatically. They then walk a polygon. They tell them the inputs, the amount of money that was spent, The ecological scientists then come along every 12 months, do an assessment of condition that's linked to the same polygon, and then from an accounting point of view, when they present this information, they have an area change, an expenditure change, and then a condition change, and then services change. And from the CFO's point of view, that's perfectly valid because they can see all of those transactions actually taking place. And that was quite a big step. That's the end of the forest example. Do you have any questions? I think I'm on time. Yep.
Water. What's that measure?
Megalitres of runoff. Yep. Why it was of particular interest is we've disaggregated the water runoff into subwater catchments because in some of the subwater catchments there is community concern about forestry within the landscape, saying that forests are bad. When you're harvesting it, you're taking all this water. When you're growing trees, you're taking all this water and it's no good. And so they're actually limited to how much they can harvest within this subcatchment on an annual basis. But when you actually do the water modelling and you look at the contrast between those that are doing pasture, cropping and forestry, forestry is real good because forestry is much closer to what the natural habitat was and the water volumes that are actually leaving their land and also the quality of that water and also the magnitudes of those flows. Because what we're finding is in the pasture system, you're having high rainfall events and a lot of the rivers are then being flushed and there's high levels of erosion and a lot of the species that live in the rivers are being killed by these high flows. So that's not happening with the water that's coming off the forest land necessarily. So it's a part of the information set that they're using and spatially disaggregating them. Yep. Yep. In the full report, we have butterflies, crayfish, eagles. I think there's probably about 60 different species, which are based on species distribution models that are done by the ecologists. And they've been then overlaid as well. But then we can join the habitat information together, like particularly with the eagles, because you need an age of a tree, height of a tree. You need at least 700 metres around that tree that needs to be undisturbed, untouched, unvisited for them to put their nests there. So that information's actually coming in as well. But this is too much to put here. That's what's in the habitat story when you go into the habitat accounts. Okay, any other question? Fundamentally, it's a process of managing the information. Yeah. So it's basically, if there is a transaction associated with capital labour, so if a field officer drives out there in their car and then sprays something, right, we want to tie that transaction back to the ecosystem. Whereas before, from an accounting point of view, it just came up weeding. That was it. It was just a cost that had no link to the ecosystem. It had no link to the condition or the services. It could be used for any company. But is it possible to use across multiple lakes? So when you've got a farm here and forestry here and something else there? Yeah, totally. Yeah, it makes no difference because in principle, the ecosystem asset, it could be a pasture area. It could be a wheat crop. It doesn't make any difference. Because if, let's say it's a wheat crop and you don't minimum till, right? So you've got erosion and a whole lot of other things that are occurring. And then you change the minimum till, so you had to buy a different tractor or a different tilling machine, you're spending different hours. You want to link that back to the change in the asset, the change in condition, and the change in the physical flows, because your water quality is going to go up, your erosion is going to go down, your nutrient input is going to go down, and your output potentially will go up or remain stable. But you want to be able to tell that story from an accounting point of view, rather than just say, we did it because it was a good thing to do. We're actually saying, no, there's a suite of services associated with that. Let's account for that. And that's the fundamental, because a lot of people are afraid of investing because you can't really bring it into the accounting system. They've had a lot of pressure put onto them saying, you should be doing this. Why is your management like that? Well, let's convert that should be into something that's quantifiable so we can make that trade-off. And I think this is the information now that needs to go back to the finance markets and banks and those that are lending money to, agroforestry or agricultural firms, so that the firms that are actually managing the landscape in an integrated way and recognising the relationship with native systems and everything else, they're actually rewarded because their portfolio of assets is more stable than one that's going, no, I'm monocropping, or I'm just treating the system as one blanket. And I think the accounting enables us to do that, or the information set enables us to do that.
How do you decide on whether those ecosystem services are actually being provided? I mean, does it distinguish between potential ecosystem services and services that are actually being delivered? So, for example, a forest might be potentially great for bird watchers, but if it's isolated and nobody is ever going to visit there in the near future, then you could argue that service is not being provided.
Yep. Yep.
Do you have to have that discussion as to whether someone could potentially provide a service or whether it's actually providing a service to the community?
It's an important discussion to have. Yep. Yep. Both. Yep. So it allows them to think, well, we do have a lot of horse riders or bird watchers that are coming in. They lease camping sites, and then they can say, now within our portfolio we've got these other areas. We'll talk to the birdwatcher group and say, do you want to go to these other areas? Because a part of it is the birdwatcher group is really interested in having outings and managing that site, right, and removing problems for particular birds, or introducing shrubs that need to be there for the birds, et cetera, et cetera. So there is both the actual and the potential.
European cap process for payment, depending, for like RDP options or anything like that. What are you paying for? You pay for the outcome, or you pay for the intention. So it's just a different set of investors, really.
Mark, just on that, should there be an arrow back from capital and labour? Should there be an arrow going back to asset condition? Because that you're changing your accounting by investing.
Yeah.
So there is.
Yep.
There is an arrow.
Yep.
It's a.
Yep. Fundamentally, they are should be going in both directions, really. Yeah. Yep. That's a good point.
Give us an example. Has this company actually used these accounts to make particular investment decisions that they wouldn't have made before?
A recent decision was with respect to carbon. So they've changed their rotation to enter into the carbon market. They're trying to join that carbon revenue up now with biodiversity and habitat. That hasn't occurred, but that's the discussion they're in now, and that's why at the state level, right across Tasmania, they're trying to enter into those discussions.
Does the government understand this? Is it, in terms of the communications, to go one way, or is it starting to go both ways now? Are the government able to say that actually makes sense to invest here in agricultural?
We held a workshop in Tasmania where all the government agencies turned up, and then they left very excited, and then it went very quiet, as typically it does with the bureaucracy. But now the excitement is sort of coming to the surface because they realise that, one of them thought about it a little bit longer and said, well, actually, we should do something here. And then they were like, oh, geez, they're doing something, aren't they? Rightio. And so now the conversation is moving up to where there was a briefing 2 weeks ago to the Minister saying, well, look, we've got planning involved, we've got Treasury involved, we've got forest products and reporting involved, we've got the State of Environment Commissioner involved. We need to do this in a joined up way, and particularly because the forestry sector in Tasmania is so important, the forestry sector is looking at the government agencies going, so what are you doing? You know, we know what's going on out there. You're using poor data to manage the landscape. We'd like to join our data up, so it's happening. It hasn't happened, but I think within the next 6 or 12 months, the whole thing will sort of roll out. Yes.
What happens if there's like data gaps for particular services or assets? Like, can you still work towards getting a balance sheet, or do you have to address those data gaps? And for example, if you have years and years of monitoring data for a particular species, but then other species are doing.
Yep.
How does that skew kind of work?
Yep. Yes, is the short answer. I tried to, maybe if we think of one cell, 1 hectare, it might have data this time series and then it wasn't monitored, or a monitoring station broke and then it's going again. We would formally enter no data. So when you're producing the accounts and then you're looking at it, it's going to have times where it has got no data. But always the landscape is fully populated. It either has data or it doesn't have data or hasn't been sampled or is missing data, but always the whole landscape in every cell must be fully populated with an either or. But you can do it with it or without it. Sorry.
What's like your economic accounting now with financial accounting years? You're like, literally a company, you say, or something has like a financial end year. Did you visit this economic accounting, environmental accounting, tying in at the same time, or is this?
This is financial accounting. This is management level accounting. So this is not economics. Economics is sort of, supply and demand curves and welfare measures. This is financial accounting. So this is at the management within management within the thing. So environmental economic accounting is sort of a misnomer. It really is financial accounting.
Just a general question about how the data is stored and managed. So we mentioned Jane asked about the InSim system that produces the heat maps. Does that manage all the data, or do you use more standard, widely used GIS? ArcGIS or QGIS, just in general, or does it vary by project, by client, by situation?
We use QGIS quite a lot because it's open source. Personally, I don't use ArcGIS. I have nothing against it per se. What we did find in the early accounting work is I had 2 land use layers which were polygons, and then I grid those 2 layers. Right, and then when I'm doing a cell-by-cell accounting, I go cell by cell to go, what were you, what are you, what's the change, and I add that up as a table, and I can represent that spatially. What I found with a lot of the commercial softwares is once I went grid by grid, there was data missing all over the place. And you didn't know as a user because the commercial software is just keeping that hidden from you. So the attraction that we found, and we ended up having to write our own software to do it. We completely separate. Yep. But the mathematical algorithms of QGIS, we build straight into InSim. We call those algorithms, and the beauty of that is that if you do have a problem, you can go back to the source code and find out, is it a math problem or is it a data problem? When we were using QGIS, we couldn't go back to the source and find out what math was actually used and why it broke. So that was there for levels of transparency. Also, from computational efficiency. We actually did the programming in MATLAB, and MATLAB is a broadly known sort of thing. But its scientific advantage is matrix algebra, and there has been decades of investment in that matrix algebra. So you can manipulate a 1 million by 1 million matrix and do all sorts of things with it in milliseconds, whereas it's very hard to do that with other math. So really, it was a math solution. Which turned out to be spatial. And actually the people who helped us build the original one, it actually came from the Defence Force. Because the Defence Force wanted to know where their soldiers were standing down to a metre, and so they had to cut the whole landscape out into grids, and it was like, sounds like it'd work for us. Anyway, so that's an aside, sorry. So I'll quickly finish off, because I'm now 4 minutes over time. And this is very quick. This is some ideas that we're discussing, the idea of potentially green printing. The idea that we have demographic census, economic census, why don't we have an environmental census? So where we look at these assets and think about what they are, where they are, what's going on with them. An economic and environmental census is not necessarily different to a household survey. You know where the household is, you know what it is, the characterise, what's it used for, etc., etc. Linking the idea of the relationship between the environment more formally to health and well-being, thinking about investment planning management, and then spatial planning and the trade-off analysis. So this is a piece of work that was just finished. It's in print, so it hasn't actually gone public yet. So these pictures are preliminary. So the reports contain three elements as urban, economic and environmental. We did the environmental analysis in partnership with SGS Economics. And basically this is a spatial map of urban and it drills down to a lot more detail. There's then an economic version of that. So this is the built assets, where they are, roads, infrastructure, hospitals and a whole lot of other things. And that includes toilets, toilet blocks, and then linking those toilets, toilet blocks to parks. So a park with a toilet block, a park with a baby changing room is very different to a park without a baby changing room. So that provides a different suite of services. And then finally, the environment, what is in the environment, what type, is it natural, is it not natural, is it something else? And then for each one of these local areas, and we call these LGAs, local government areas, so they go down to quite small areas. This is the type of profiling that we do. So there are a number of indicators. These indicators were chosen by the project, so they was chosen by the LGAs and the councils themselves, so it wasn't something that we decided. And then the regional overview, so what are some of the challenges, the strengths, and that type of thing. And it's using the same information set in an integrated way. So if you came along and said, I don't necessarily like these indicators, or can we look at some other elements, you can then use the same information set. And you can actually join the different elements together. You might look at stream condition, canopy cover with flood risk. Find places in the landscape where all of those things exist or may not exist. And then finally, the idea of that was then to join it with open space analysis, and then figure out good areas, bad areas, how they're perceived by the community. And then open space by ownership was another question. Is it public, restricted public, or pure private? And thinking about the distribution of that and how planning policies could change that combination. Thank you for your time. Any other questions, or I'll just get out of here now?
Forest benchmark has been used by other forest companies in Australia or in the region? Or?
We're talking to a number of other forest companies, both within the national context and in the international context. Nobody's really gone to this level of detail. And New Forest are keeping watching brief on it, because Foraco is one of the child companies of New Forest. And if you look at the sustainability reporting of New Forest, the last two, I think the last one was just published in the last couple of weeks, they're starting to talk a lot more about it. So there's been no formal movement to that, but I think they're having those conversations. Thank you.